Grace, mercy, and peace belong to you. They are free gifts from the one who was and is to come. Amen. Well, our long wait is almost over. A few nights from now, when we gather back at 7 p.m. for our annual Christmas Eve cantata and communion service, we will celebrate the coming of the Christ child, the coming of the one who existed before all time and who entered our time in human form in order to assure our future for all time. As we worship on this final Sunday of Advent, we also find ourselves pregnant with hope and possibility as we wait with Mary, the expectant mother of Jesus, a reluctant prophet whose role in the nativity drama is often misunderstood and perhaps underappreciated. For those of the Roman Catholic tradition, Mary is almost of equal status with her son, while Protestants tend to the other extreme of seeing her only for her biological role, a mere peasant woman, teenager really, chosen to be the Theotokos, the Greek word meaning the bearer of God. But the author of the Gospel of Luke sees Mary differently. Luke portrays Mary not as a plaster saint or an obscure nobody from a small town in the middle of nowhere, but as someone in a starring role, someone from a long line of biblical prophets, someone whose revolutionary way of partnering with God is a model for the rest of us to imitate. It's hard to imagine a more unlikely context for transforming the world. For who could really believe? We still have trouble with this today. Who could really believe that the creator of the universe would reduce God's self to the size of a human embryo and then allow the announcement of the coming divinity being joined to humanity for all time to be proclaimed by two such unlikely messengers? Both pregnant women, one, Elizabeth, a woman beyond reasonable childbearing age, and the other, a young unmarried girl barely out of puberty. The world was expecting a military conqueror as its Messiah, but what people got instead was a barely noticed, squalling baby born to poor parents in a straw-covered dirt floor of a barn. Such was the upside-down world inaugurated by the incarnation of Jesus the Christ. And much as I wish it were otherwise, I do recognize that for many, Advent is simply a commemoration of an ancient over and done with event. But truly, it is not. When viewed through the eyes of Mary and her expectant cousin Elizabeth, the nativity setting is a story of the ongoing process of God coming to us still, even to this day. It's told through the extravagant exuberance of something we call the Magnificat, that monumental song of Mary, one of the first hymns of the church, really, which we will sing together at the conclusion of my reflection this morning. Magnificat comes from the Latin word of the first line of Mary's song. Magnificat anima mea Dominum. My soul magnifies the Lord. These are the first words from the mouth of a soon-to-be Mother of God upon being greeted by her older cousin Elizabeth, who is pregnant with a son who will turn out to be John the Baptist. The Magnificat, celebrated by Bach and Vivaldi and countless other composers through the centuries, is one of the most recognized songs in the rich heritage of our faith. It is sung as almost as a show-stopping aria in the announcement of what is to come. It's a soaring testimony in operatic language, if you will, of how we are to believe, of what happens when faith is shared in community and not hoarded, and how revolutionary language can reverse the fortunes of the downtrodden. Or in any time and age, especially the troubled, self-centered, greedy, fearful, anxious, and violent world we live in right now, the Magnificat is a clarion call to participate with and partner with our God in bringing the promises of heaven to earth. What the Magnificat reveals is that we're not passive, sitting on our hands observers of an ancient story that's over and done with, but we're central actors in a grand recreation drama that continues to unfold even while we're sitting here. The first part of Mary's song celebrates what God has done for her in lifting her from a lowly status to be the mother of Jesus. The second part of the Magnificat deals with the communal act that follows, the divine reversal of fortunes, where the poor are exalted over the rich and powerful. This celebratory canticle of praise gives us three characteristics of Mary that are worth emulating and remembering. The first is a reluctant and even frightened Mary that could describe a lot of us. Says yes to God. Standing at the intersection of the old and the new, when the angel Gabriel informs her that she's pregnant by the Holy Spirit, her first words are, "How is this possible? How can this be?" But she quickly catches her breath and exclaims in one of the truer expressions of faith in all the Bible, "Here I am, here am I, the servant of the Lord. Let it be with me according to your word." Mary was such an unlikely vessel for the Theotokos, the God-bearer. But then her reluctance falls into a clear pattern of unlikely messengers that we find elsewhere in the Bible. Prophets from the Old Testament, all of whom at first glance, at first response, protested, "Oh no, not me. You got the wrong person. You can't mean me." But God does mean you and me and all of us. Throughout the sweeping story of Israel, from an itinerant nomad named Abraham to Moses in the burning bush, to Ruth and Hannah, to Elijah on Mount Carmel, to the shepherd boy king David, to the young prophet Jeremiah, who wasn't much older than Mary when anointed by God. From all of these reluctant, hesitant, timid, frightful, uncertain messengers and prophets, we see that the least are the most in the eyes of God. God is always choosing people, but not so much for a role or a task, but to be God's self in the world. Each and every one of us in our own way and in our own situation. If we allow ourselves to experience being chosen, being God's beloved, being somehow God's presence in the world, we will invariably and naturally communicate that same closeness to God to those around us. And thus the mystery passes from age to age. As one writer put it, we do have roles and tasks in this world, but finally they're all one and the same: to uniquely be divine love in a way that no one else can or will. There's no one, not one single one, who is called to do what you alone can do. The takeaway lesson is that when we're tempted to be less than what God has intended us to be, we need to remember who and whose we are and empty ourselves to that spiritual fullness. Paul had a word for that. It's called kenosis, which means making room for God in your soul. Like when you have a visitor in your home, you put stuff away, you rearrange the spare room, and you get it ready for a guest. You make your house ready for the visitor. In the same way, we're called to make room for God in our soul. It's when we give way to that blind trust instead of responding to God with our minds. Oh, no, not me, I can't. How can that be? It's ridiculous, it's impossible. It is that moment when we remember with Mary that nothing is impossible with God when we say yes. And these are especially poignant words for our congregation, this body of Christ known as St. John, as we engage in our own ongoing discernment and listening to God's intention for this community in the future. The second quality Mary shows us is that faith lives in and is strengthened by community. I say this so often that sometimes I worry like I'm sounding like a broken record. But oh, how I wish we could really hear this. When Mary sings that her soul magnifies the Lord, she is affirming that faith is increased, much like light through a stained glass window when it is shared in community. In this case, with her cousin Elizabeth. Whether an uncertain Mary goes to Elizabeth for her own affirmation of what she heard from Gabriel, or whether Mary goes to offer confirmation and encouragement to Elizabeth for her pregnancy's role, her role in this grand story. The point is that both were confirmed in their belief by each other, by their shared stories. They needed each other, just as we need each other today. And when we make a connection with others of faith in community, God removes our isolation and helps us to understand ourselves more fully as part of something larger than ourselves and our individual destinies. That thought came back to mind last night as I was watching the debates and as I watched debates in the previous week. We are a part of something larger than our individual selves and fears. When people are together in faith, sharing their stories and their experiences, as we did a little bit last week when we talked about experiences of being happy, then we are known more fully and begin to see more clearly than we do on our own. This is the truth of how our faith grew over the last 2,000 years, and this is the truth of why many churches are in decline today, all because of our distressing tendency to privatize and internalize what we believe. It's nobody's business but my own, instead of sharing what's in our heart. Thirdly and last, Mary, the reluctant prophet, challenges us to participate with God in bringing the promises of heaven to earth in the fullness of God's good time. Advent portends a Christmas future, a new world, a future transformation. It's most definitely not about a mass migration from a doomed planet to a blessed heaven. Advent and Christmas are about the coming end of an era of war and violence and injustice and oppression, and the inauguration of a new world of justice and peace. Nativity stories that we share this season are not about a spectacular series of miraculous events that we are to believe for the sake of our own personal salvation, but rather they are about God's passion, God's dream for a transformed earth. Now, I know some will say, it's a pipe dream. But the angel's parting words to Mary, nothing is impossible with God. The same words spoken to Sarah upon learning she was pregnant with Isaac. Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? In this quasi-Pentecostal moment between Elizabeth and Mary, when one generation makes way for the next, something else we have in common. The exuberance is no longer Mary singing her song, but it's the song singing Mary. And we're swept away when we hear these words and the lyricism of hope. Barbara Brown Taylor, one of my favorite writers, a former Episcopal priest and writer and essayist, says, Mary is transformed by the Spirit of God from an awkward, scared teenager into an articulate, radical, and astonished prophet singing about a world in which the last have become first and the first last. Another voice, Henry Nouwen, says, God's most radical intervention in history, the coming of God among us, is a celebration of the tables turned or overturned. Overturned where the lowly are lifted up and the proud are brought down and the hungry fed. All of that delivered from the wombs of two obscure but remarkable women who were full participants with God in remaking the world. And even more remarkable, and I ask you to listen for this when we stand and sing this song in just a few moments, we notice that Mary is singing about a reborn world not in some distant future tense, pointing to some past that's been cleaned up and overcome, but she's singing in the present as if a new world order has already come. The phrase that comes to mind is, speak it into being. This is what God's time looks like when our human limited tenses have been jumbled and we see every moment as already here, the promise of what is to come as if it's already happening. Act the way you want to be. And in the subversive world of the Christmas story, God's topsy-turvy world is an accomplished fact. This then is the final truth of Mary's song, that we are called to be full partners with God, full partners in the continuing act of redeeming a fallen world. It is in that conundrum, that catch-22, the ultimate mystery of our faith. We are to do it with God, but we can't do it without God. Appropriate words for this congregation as it ponders and prays over a new future waiting to be born. St. Augustine said it similarly. God without us will not. We without God cannot. We who have seen the star and heard the angels sing are called to participate in the new birth and the new world proclaimed by these stories. It's not a fond reminiscence, it's a call to action. And dare we dream, as we contemplate the promises of God, of our own Christmas aria, both individually and collectively, of what our world would look like if we were to sing the Magnificat today in our own words and from our own setting. Could we do it? Could we really do it? Can we envision a transformed world as if it's already here? If you can envision such a world in your mind's eye, you can see it with the eyes of your heart, and you can bring it to fruition by the work of your hands. A world where a violent culture is but a distant memory, and our security and community flows from our love and tolerance for one another instead of from our mindless and uninformed fears. Where no one will be denied comfort. No one will be denied comfort and care from the ravages of illness because we take care of our own in community, rather than looking out for just ourselves at the expense of others less fortunate, where health care is a function of compassionate hearts rather than our pocketbooks, a world where all are welcomed in community, regardless of skin color, language, gender preference, income level, or education, where hunger is no more because those who are abundantly blessed share with those who have less, and those without a place to lay their head at night will always have a home. A world where war and rivalries between nations will fall before the banner of God's kingdom coming to earth in the here and now. When we stop seeing problems and start seeing possibilities, that is when God stirs to action. What an aria that could be. What a future. What a Magnificat to sing in the 21st century. What a time to say yes with Mary. Let it be with me. Not somebody else, but me. Let it be with me, Lord. Let it be according to your will. I invite you to hold that thought in your heart as we stand and sing together the composer Marty Haugen's wonderful rendition of the Magnificat.